Welcome to Mapping Minerals Diplomacy, an explainer series that brings clarity to the deals, players, and policies shaping the global race for critical minerals. I'm your host, Gracelin Baskaran, Director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at CSIS. In this episode, we spotlight Brazil, one of the world's mineral powerhouses that has come into focus amidst recent tariff announcements. Brazil has significant reserves of mineral resources. It ranks number 1 in the world for niobium, 2 for rare earths, graphite, and iron ore, 3rd for manganese and nickel, 4th for bauxite, 6th for zinc, and 7th for lithium. Yet much of this vast wealth remains untapped. Let's turn to the data. In 2024, Brazil produced just 0.01% of the world's rare earths, despite being home to 23.3% of the world's reserves. It produced 4.3% of the world's graphite, despite having nearly 26% of reserves. Manganese, it produced 3% of the world's output, but has 16% of the world's reserves. And for nickel, it produced just 2.5% of the world's output, despite being home to 12% of reserves. The bilateral U.S.-Brazil relationship is consequential to U.S. national security interests. Commodities like niobium, rare earths, nickel, graphite, and manganese are vital to producing defense technologies. But the United States has less than 2% of the world's nickel, graphite, rare earths, and niobium. Given these vast resource endowments, it's no surprise that in 2024, Brazil ranked as the 8th largest recipient of exploration investment worldwide. Between 2019 and 2024, investment in exploration in Brazil's mining sector surged by 51.5%, reflecting a sharp upward trend in investor interest. This is despite less than 50% of Brazil being geologically mapped. Copper has remained the largest source of exploration investment, increasing from $129 million in 2019 to $130 million in 2024. In 2024, copper accounted for 32.7% of total exploration spending in Brazil, underscoring its emergence as a key frontier for future copper development. Despite accounting for only 1.9% of global copper production that year, the substantial exploration investment signals strong industry confidence in Brazil's untapped copper potential. The successful growth of Brazil's mining sector is deeply intertwined with the success of the Brazilian economy. Recent figures show that the mining sector provided direct employment to approximately 204,000 individuals and supported an additional 2.3 million jobs indirectly. The United States and Brazil maintain a vital economic partnership that is beneficial to both nations' prosperity. Brazil stands as the world's 8th largest economy, with the United States serving as its 2nd largest trading partner and its top source of foreign direct investment. In recent years, minerals have featured strongly in the bilateral relationship. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, has invested significant equity into TechMet's nickel and cobalt mine in Brazil. In 2024, Serra Verde, a Brazilian rare earths project, was backed by the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership, and the DFC opened its first office in Latin America in Brazil last year. However, there are several key challenges that need to be addressed to stimulate private investment in Brazil's mining sector. First, Brazil needs to improve its ease of doing business. Brazil's mining sector often faces significant obstacles due to the country's complex bureaucracy and regulatory burdens, which pose significant challenges for business operations. In 2020, Brazil ranked 124th out of 190 countries in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business, driven primarily by poor performance in categories such as obtaining permits and managing tax compliance. Second, there's significant room to improve its regulatory environment. Brazil's regulatory environment remains a major barrier to mining investment. Permitting is notoriously complex, involving overlapping federal, state, and municipal authorities, with approvals often taking up to 10 years. As part of the 2021 Pro-Strategic Minerals Policy, the government committed to streamlining these procedures. However, as of 2023, officials from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, responsible for overseeing the National Mining Agency, reported a backlog of at least 35,000 pending applications. This bureaucracy, combined with opaque tax rules, drives the so-called Brazil cost, which adds an estimated 1.7 trillion Brazilian reals, or approximately 19.5% of GDP, to the cost of doing business. Now, there have been steps to improve this. In July 2025, the Brazilian Congress approved the General Environmental Licensing Law, a landmark reform intended to modernize and streamline the country's environmental permitting system. One of the law's most notable features is the introduction of the Special Environmental License, which allows fast-track approval within 12 months for projects deemed strategic by the federal government. And third, Brazil needs to increase its investments in infrastructure. Brazil's public investment in infrastructure has consistently fallen below both regional and income group benchmarks. In 2021, just 1.57% of Brazil's budget was invested in infrastructure, and by 2022, the Ministry of Infrastructure received the lowest share for its budget allocation in GDP terms in 11 years. The National Railway, which is how most commodities should move, spans 31,299 kilometers, but just 10,000 kilometers are actively used for commercial operations. As this graph shows, when looking at most major countries in the world, the US, India, South Africa, China, Argentina, Mexico, Canada, Russia, Australia, and Brazil, Brazil actually has the lowest railway density in the world, just 3.61 kilometers per 1,000 square kilometers, which is low, the lowest amongst all of these countries. Now, strengthening bilateral minerals diplomacy between the United States and Brazil is crucial for countering China. Between 2007 and 2022, China invested nearly $4.5 billion in Brazil's mining sector, accounting for more than 6% of global outbound investment during that period. Today, as China seeks to scale its dominance in high-tech manufacturing, particularly electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, and permanent magnets, Brazil is emerging as a critical supplier of these inputs needed for these sectors, given it holds substantial reserves of the minerals needed for these industries. Yet there remains enormous potential to elevate the US-Brazil partnership, unlocking stronger mineral security while deepening a resilient and strategic bilateral economic relationship. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Brian Menell, CEO of TechMet. As mentioned earlier, TechMet received a U.S. equity investment for a nickel and cobalt mine in Brazil, and Brian has firsthand experience navigating the mining landscape. Brian, it's so good to have you here.
Great. Nice to be here, Gracelin.
Brian, can you tell us a little bit on a high level about what some of the key opportunities and challenges are for deepening kind of U.S. engagement in the mining sector particularly?
As you outlined earlier, Gracelin, Brazil is very, very well endowed with critical minerals, and therefore the potential to develop these resources beyond historical development is enormous, both in terms of the value it can have for Brazilian development and wealth, and in terms of what it can do to support secure supply chains for US national security and industry. And Brazil has a lot of advantages in this regard beyond the endowment and the resources that exist in Brazil. It's a very well-established mining jurisdiction in terms of functional regulatory environment, albeit bureaucratic and not all as simple as you previously mentioned, but nonetheless educated and experienced. It has a very good infrastructure from a point of view of mining expertise and capacity to execute and implement projects. And it's very well situated geographically for the United States from a point of view of efficient logistics. So it is, it has enormous potential to be increasingly important as a supplier of minerals to the United States industry.
And what are some of the challenges of Brazil? It's a country that's making a lot of strides to improve its environment, but what are some of the challenges in Brazil from your perspective?
Every country in which one operates, and we have projects in 8 countries presently, has its unique challenges bureaucratically, politically, culturally, and Brazil is no exception. However, Brazil, is a country in which people have successfully invested and built mining operations for many, many years, both domestic Brazilian interests and foreign investors. And for us, at least in Brazil, we've had a lot of state government support, a lot of federal government support, and all of our licensing processes have been reasonably smoothly and successfully executed.
And Brian, what does effective U.S. government support to developing Brazil's mining sector? As you mentioned, being a hemispheric ally has a significant advantage. We know that logistics are at a significant cost to an already costly sector. So what does effective government support look like based on your own experience working with the DFC, and how can we do more?
Yeah, TechMet being part owned by the U.S. government through the now 3 rounds of DFC equity investment in TechMet has been given a very warm welcome by Brazilian authorities and regulators. And therefore, just simply US government support for TechMet at the holding company level has provided a lot of value to us and allowed us to bring in other investors and do what we have done and what we're now scaling in Brazil. Beyond that, we are busy, as we announced last year, with a more substantial DFC project debt participation in the further large-scale expansion of our Piaui nickel project, and that type of support to de-risk and reduce cost of capital and execute on large-scale funding packages is, obviously enormously valuable, particularly in the present weak and depressed market environment for nickel, which is temporary and will radically correct in the coming years, but nonetheless makes funding in the short term challenging. High-level diplomatic engagement and alignment at the government-to-government level on critical mineral supply chain security strategies likewise creates a landscape that is very supportive and enabling of what we and some others are doing in Brazil.
Yeah, the diplomatic engagement consistently emerges as a key theme of how the U.S. can create a more enabling environment for the private sector. Well, what measures can Brazil take to attract a greater amount of foreign direct investment into its mining industry?
Countries, all resource-rich countries, and Brazil being no exception, can always do better with the efficient implementation of their regulatory environment, their licensing processes, their environmental licensing procedures and rules. And Brazil, as you mentioned earlier, Gracelin, is doing a lot to address those bottlenecks and inefficiencies to attract more investment and allow foreign investors and domestic investors to build bigger projects quicker and more efficiently. In terms of domestic funding support, again, it's growing. Brazilian government agencies, BNDES and others, are accelerating their focus and deployment of funding support in critical minerals projects, both primary extraction and processing, and that will grow as it is in the US and elsewhere in the world.
And how will you've talked about this equity investment that was made, but in what ways will the Piaui project actually enhance US mineral security?
Piaui is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest and we believe the best nickel shovel-ready developable nickel project in the world, certainly outside of Indonesia, which has been the focus of a lot of nickel industry investment and development, largely funded and controlled by Chinese interests over the last few years. So Piaui nickel, which we're developing and expanding in Brazil, is an opportunity to balance that increasing and overwhelming reliance of US industry and other US economic allies on largely Chinese-controlled Indonesian sources of supply. Nickel is an extremely crucial and strategic material, as you outlined and summarized earlier, and without secure, cost-effective, clean, well-governed supply of nickel, a lot of US technologies and industries and manufacturing will be prejudiced in terms of competitiveness and hence growth and creating jobs and national security and economic activity.
Brian, you mentioned China, the Chinese dominance, Indonesian dominance. Now, in the current environment of nickel prices, we've seen mines close in places like New Caledonia and in Australia. How is Brazil's project here going to compete with the really low production cost of Indonesia?
I mean, we as Brazilian Nickel, which is a company that we as TechMet control and have funded, have pioneered a novel heap leach process for extracting nickel from a particular type of nickel graphite resource, which we have explored and are developing in Piaui. And that is a very low cost, very clean process. So we can compete with Indonesian production in cost terms, which a lot of the legacy historical production out of Australia and Canada cannot. So in the short-term market weakness, where oversupply is being encouraged by Chinese interest to consolidate medium-term supply, we can still fund and build and develop and provide returns even before markets return to normality and go into structural shortage, which they most certainly will, be it in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years.
You know, what's interesting is often when we look at our shortages now, we probably should have acted 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, in 3 or 4 years when prices recover, it would be a tragedy if we didn't have non-Chinese projects on hand. You know, the other thing that jumps out to me about this project is it's such a good example of where innovation actually can allow us to compete with China.
Yeah, and this is, the case across all of our metals and these critical mineral supply chain security issues that we have to address. We need innovation. We need to do things differently in order to do them bigger, quicker, and cleaner, and balance China's incumbent position where they've built, obviously, overwhelmingly dominant degrees of influence or control across all of these global supply chains.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gracelin.
And with that brings us to the end of this episode of Mapping Minerals Diplomacy. In future episodes, we'll explore how other countries are shaping their minerals diplomacy strategies and how the U.S. can better deploy its tools to compete. Thanks for watching. I'm Gracelin Baskaran. See you next time on Mapping Minerals Diplomacy.